What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
The day everything changed forever. That is the only way I can describe what happened at Thanksgiving, because up until that moment I had been the reliable daughter, the one who never made a scene, the one who kept the family peace by swallowing whatever comment was tossed my way, and then, in a single instant, I decided I was done carrying that role like it was a badge of honor instead of a chain. We were all seated around the dining table, the usual spread of food in front of us, and everyone had just finished congratulating Emily on her engagement. When Mom turned her head toward me with that smile she wears when she's about to land a jab dressed up as small talk, and she said, "Your sister just got engaged. When will you finally find someone?" The whole room shifted, like her words had been the cue for a performance everyone else had been waiting for, and all eyes turned to me. For a moment, I felt that old instinct telling me to laugh it off, maybe say something self-deprecating. To make it easier for everyone else, because that's what I always used to do, but I stopped myself. I picked up my glass, took a slow sip, and then I said, as evenly as I could, "I already did, but I don't invite people who doubt me." And in that second, the room went silent in a way it never had before. I could feel the weight of the pause pressing on every corner of the table, Emily shifting uncomfortably as if my words had stolen her spotlight, Brett giving a half-smile that disappeared when Emily shot him a look, and Dad staring down at the breadbasket like if he just focused hard enough on carbs the whole conversation might go away. It was Mom who tried to recover first, raising her voice just enough to remind everyone that families shouldn't have secrets, which was her way of pretending that her comment was innocent and my response had overstepped. She went further, saying that if I respected Emily, I would share my own plans and introduce my partner, because apparently my private life had become part of the family's group project. I kept my tone calm and told her that relationships are not subject to committee votes, which earned a chuckle from Brett until Emily elbowed him sharply enough to make him clear his throat and look down at his plate. That tiny break in the tension only made Mom more determined, and she switched to her favorite tactic, morality. She reminded everyone about past mistakes in the family, suggesting that unless she knew every detail about Jordan, she could not trust that I wasn't heading straight for a disaster that would somehow also be her responsibility to clean up. That was the moment I stopped playing defense and said out loud what had been sitting in my chest for years, that I was the one who had covered Dad's emergency roof repairs when his hours were cut, that I was the one who made sure the lights stayed on without demanding recognition, and that I was tired of pretending those things didn't count. Mom's reply was that money and favors were not the same as family loyalty, which sounded noble until you remembered she had no problem cashing the checks when they arrived. I didn't push further, because I could feel my pulse beating too hard in my temples, and I knew that if I let myself keep going, I would say something I couldn't take back. So I finished my food in silence, not because I agreed with her, but because I had finally learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to keep the argument alive. Dad cleared plates without meeting my eyes, which told me everything I needed to know about how much he had already surrendered to survival. Emily announced the date she had in mind for the wedding and bragged about a venue she had already soft reserved, her voice clipped and competitive like this was less about marriage and more about winning a contest. I smiled, congratulated her in a single sentence, and gave her nothing else to chew on. After dessert, Mom followed me out to the porch, clearly unwilling to leave the night without trying to regain control. She dropped her voice to that faux gentle tone she uses when she wants to sound concerned but really intends to corner you, and she said there were things about Jordan I needed to admit before someone else brought them into the open. I told her that if she was getting information from someone else about my relationship, then she was listening to the wrong people, and I meant every word of it. She tilted her head, the way she does when she thinks she has the upper hand, and told me she already knew where Jordan worked, as if she was about to reveal a scandal that would collapse everything I believed in. My stomach tightened, because if she really had something solid she would have led with it, but instead she was dangling shadows, which told me the truth. She didn't know enough to hurt me yet, but she knew just enough to try. I refused to bite, and I said, "Then ask your source to send it to me." She didn't answer, which was all the confirmation I needed that she had nothing concrete. For the first time in years, I felt like I had taken back ground instead of losing it. I left that night with a strange calm running through me, because I knew that by speaking one line at the table and standing my ground on the porch, I had shifted the entire balance. It was no longer about whether my family approved of my relationship. It was about whether I would continue to let them treat my life like a communal property to be debated and dissected. The silence after my line had been loud enough to tell me that every single person in that room understood something had changed, even if they couldn't admit it yet. And while Mom believed she had planted a seed of suspicion by hinting at Jordan's job, what she didn't realize was that she had also exposed her own strategy. She would rather undermine than support, and she was willing to use gossip as a weapon. That knowledge didn't scare me, it prepared me. Because once you see someone's playbook, you stop being surprised by the plays. The part that still lingered as I drove home was the question of who exactly had given her the information about Jordan's work, and how far they were willing to push it, because if there's one thing I've learned in this family, it's that secrets rarely stay contained once someone decides to weaponize them. And so while Thanksgiving ended in silence, it didn't end in peace, because now I had to ask myself, what exactly does Mom think she knows, and who else has been talking behind my back? When I met Jordan the next morning at the coffee place near the hospital, the one where the chairs wobble a little, but the staff will actually tell you when the Wi-Fi is down so you do not sit there pretending to work while a page refuses to load, I laid out exactly what Carol had said with that slow, deliberate cadence I use when I am trying to keep my pulse steady, and Jordan, who never confuses calm with weakness, listened without interrupting and then explained that the so-called rumor had a grain of truth wrapped in just enough ambiguity to tempt a person like my mother into believing she held a live wire, because Jordan's firm had recently absorbed Frank's old employer and Jordan, as part of a finance team cleaning up legacies and deferred liabilities and those stray obligations that outlive the people who sign them, had seen an anonymized name set that likely included my father's file, which Jordan did not open due to both company policy and personal ethics, yet the mere existence of overlap meant that a half-listener could spin it into a story where Jordan knew something about our family that Jordan had somehow kept from me, which, if you know anything about how compliance actually works, is exactly how it is supposed to be handled. I felt that hot flush behind my eyes that says I am not angry yet, but I am very close, and I asked the only question that mattered, which was whether Jordan's work could affect Frank in any real way. And Jordan said there was a strong chance that during the chaos of the layoff, Frank had been offered a window to exercise a small batch of options that many employees miss, because the paperwork is written by people who think clarity is a threat. And if Frank could locate the packet and sign the right page before a secondary deadline, the conversion might not make anyone rich, but could push down the balance on the credit card Frank had been using to float copays when his hours evaporated. And I sat there realizing that what my mother wanted to paint as a scandal might actually be an opportunity, not a rescue, but a responsible action that required attention and honest signatures rather than whispers and shortcuts. I called Frank from the sidewalk because I did not want to put this into a thread where Carol could pretend she had been consulted, and Frank answered in that careful tone of a man who thinks bad news only arrives by phone. And when I asked if he remembered hearing the word options at the exit meeting, he said no, then yes, then that Carol had handled the binder, which told me more than any yes or no could have told me. And I asked Frank to look in the basement files, even though Frank hates the basement because in our family basements are where truths go to gather dust, and he said he would try after dinner, and he hung up fast, like the call was oxygen he could not afford to waste. That night a push notification hit Frank's cloud account and forwarded to me because years ago Frank asked me to set up alerts during a different crisis and forgot to turn them off. And the alert said a password reset had been attempted on his old benefits portal from a device that was not his, followed by a successful login from a device labeled Brett. And before I could rationalize any of it away, Frank texted me a screenshot and the short, terrified line, "Did you tell Emily?" And I replied that I had told no one and asked him to log out everywhere and change the password while I made some calls, and then I stared at the name Brett. on the screen and felt that tunnel sensation that means your body has already decided to fight even if your mind is still arranging the details. I called Emily first because I wanted to give her one clean chance to be honest, and Emily went straight to a justification speech so fast she forgot to craft the preface, saying that she and Brett were just trying to help Dad. And that timing was everything now that deposits were due and the venue had promised a discount if they locked in by the end of the week. And when I asked who said Dad would not mind if some funds were redirected, Emily said Mom had explained that family share resources, and then Brett took the phone and announced that he had tech skills and had only been checking the portal to make sure nothing was being left on the table. And when I told Brett that logging into someone else's account without consent is not help, but an actual violation with audit logs and IP addresses and terms of use that do not care about family trees, Brett laughed with that confident ignorance that passes for charisma at parties and said no one prosecutes family, and I told Brett that companies do not know you are family. Companies know credentials and timestamps and policies that trigger letters sent by certified mail, and he finally stopped talking. I called Jordan again, not because I needed permission to be angry, but because I wanted a second set of eyes on my next steps, and Jordan said to document everything in plain language, to save the screenshots in 2 places, to capture the timeline in a note to myself as if I were explaining it to a compliance officer who had never met any of us, and to keep my voice low because the fastest way to lose leverage in a situation like this is to sound like you are enjoying the fight. And I knew Jordan was right, because while outrage feels good for about 5 minutes, written proof and measured sentences are what actually move a problem from personal drama to formal remedy. In the morning, Frank called with that breathless relief of someone who has found something exactly where he feared it would not be, and he said he had located the old binder and a thin packet with a tab that read Equity, and a page that mentioned a secondary exercise window, and he asked if I would help him read it because the language made him feel stupid, and I told Frank that the language is designed to make good people feel stupid because confusion is a kind of tax, and we agreed that I would swing by after work, and for a brief hour I let myself believe that the worst of it might be reparable if everyone acted like adults for once. That fantasy lasted until mid-afternoon when Frank sent a new photo that made my chest go cold in a way I do not recommend. Because the image was a county clerk envelope addressed to me at the family house with a sticky note on top in Carol's careful script that said, "Handle this, since you love paperwork." And the corner of the envelope was torn just enough to show a lender's logo I recognized from wedding forums and a line that looked exactly like the kind of installment notice you receive when someone opens a credit product tied to a venue, and I understood in a flash that while I had been gathering facts and offering clean paths, someone else had already tried to purchase a shortcut using my name. Which meant I was not walking into a conversation anymore. I was walking into a decision about whether to remain the family's silent collateral or to expose, in daylight and in order, the way my signature had apparently become a communal tool. When I pulled into the driveway and walked into the kitchen that had served as the stage for every lecture, bargain, and half apology of my childhood, I already knew I was not there to negotiate feelings or rehash Thanksgiving etiquette, but to determine, with the kind of clarity that holds up in daylight and under an auditor's lamp, whether my name had been used to shoulder a debt tied to a party I did not plan, and when Carol slid the county clerk envelope across the table with that familiar, practiced calm and said, almost sweetly, that since I love paperwork, I should be the one to tidy up a few loose ends. I opened the flap with deliberate care and saw exactly what I expected to see and still felt that punch of disbelief. Because there it was in black ink and standardized font, a lender's notice referencing a venue installment account that listed me as cosigner, with a signature that looked like mine in the way a photocopy looks like a photograph if you stand far enough back. And convince yourself that the smudges are shadows, the date aligning so neatly with the week I had been in Dallas for a work training that I almost laughed out loud at the arrogance of it, and when I said, as evenly as I could manage, that this document was not a misunderstanding or a family favor, but an unauthorized use of my identity, Carol told me to lower my voice, because the neighbors did not need to hear private issues, which in this house has always been code for facts that would make me look bad. I asked the only question that matters when a boundary has been crossed in ink. Who signed this? Who filled out the application? Who uploaded a copy of my license? And who decided that my credit history, which I've guarded through every emergency and impulse, should be the scaffolding for a venue deposit? And Carol, in the kind of circular logic that makes you feel exhausted even before your coffee cools, said I had implicitly authorized family decisions like this for years because I had always been the one to step in when things got complicated. Which is like saying that because I once paid the roofer after a storm ripped shingles off the house, I therefore consented to anyone opening a line of credit in my name whenever the calendar contained a celebration. And when I told her that adults go to banks with their own names, she pivoted to sentiment and asked if I really wanted Emily to start her marriage under a cloud, a question designed to suggest that the only thing standing between my sister and Joy was my refusal to be a convenient signature. Frank had been standing by the sink holding a towel he never used, looking like a man who has spent decades training himself to breathe shallow so as not to disturb the air, and when I turned to him and asked if he had seen any of this paperwork before it was mailed, he shook his head once and then said, too quickly, that he thought there had been a phone call with the venue where someone explained that I would be the cosigner because I was best positioned, a phrase that sent a cold electric wave through me because it was the kind of corporate phrasing Carol picks up from brochures and repeats until it sounds inevitable, and I understood for the first time that this was not a sloppy accident or an ill-advised shortcut but a tactic, rehearsed and executed under the assumption that my silence would arrive on schedule. I told them both that I would not be the quiet end of the story, that I was prepared to contact the lender, the venue, and, if necessary, the police, not to create a spectacle, but because I have learned that some problems do not respond to "Let's keep this in the family," but only to documents, timestamps, and the blunt language of policy, and as I gathered the pages I noticed a second, thinner document at the bottom of the envelope, yellowed at the edges and embossed with a trust stamp. And when I unfolded it, I recognized Grandma Ruth's attorney's letterhead and a simple clause written in plain English that even a tired brain could follow, stating that if the house were ever used to pressure or humiliate a named heir, the controlling interest would transfer to the heir most likely to preserve stability, and my name, not Emily's, stood there without apology, which meant Grandma had anticipated this exact pattern, a mother who manages with shame and a daughter who survives with compliance, and had left a handhold for the day when compliance finally cracked. Carol called the clause cruel and accused me of weaponizing a dead woman's words, but what I heard, in the quiet space after her outrage, was Grandma's voice from years ago when she pressed a key into Frank's palm after a blow-up that sent Aunt Deborah to a motel with a suitcase and a flip phone. A memory that snapped into focus when Frank reached into his pocket now and handed me a single key on a bare ring and said, with a mix of apology and relief, that the key went to the locked file cabinet in the garage and that there were extras in the top drawer, which was his way of saying he had kept pieces of truth stashed in metal when paper felt too flimsy to hold them. Before I left the table, I made my offer, not because I owed them a compromise, but because I wanted a record that I had tried to solve this without lighting the whole house on fire, and the offer was simple and time-bound. Emily and Brett would remove my name from any credit line or application within 2 business days, reimburse any charges that had already posted, and put all future wedding costs under their own signatures. In exchange, I would refrain, for now, from filing a formal report, while we also set an appointment to walk Dad through the benefits packet to see if the options window Jordan thought might exist was still open, which could actually improve the family's finances without stealing anything from anyone. Carol called it a threat. I called it a boundary with a deadline, and Frank, who has built a life out of not choosing, finally nodded toward my terms like a man who has found a map in a drawer he forgot he owned. On my way out, I texted Jordan a brief update with photos attached, not for rescue, but to create a time-stamped ledger of what I had seen, and Jordan replied in that spare, steady way that has become my anchor, saying that my judgment was sound and that if I wanted a second witness at any meeting they would show up and keep the conversation inside the lines, which mattered to me more than any show of outrage, because rage can be borrowed, but steadiness has to be earned. And I say this knowing. Someone will argue with me in the comments, but I have been 20 years into my job, which I started 8 years ago, and that is how time feels in families that make you older than your age, which is the point more than the math. I unlocked the garage cabinet that evening with the key Frank had given me and found, in the top drawer under a stack of warranties for appliances no one had maintained, a photocopy of my driver's license with a sticky note in Carol's handwriting that read, "For venue," a fax authorization form signed on behalf of Lauren in a slanted hand that mimicked mine just enough to fool a clerk on a busy afternoon, and a one-page instruction sheet from the venue explaining how to complete a signature by proxy when the second signer could not be present, which is not a real thing in any jurisdiction I know, but looks real enough to grease a process when a manager wants the booking and a customer wants the illusion of compliance. I took high-resolution photos of everything, slid the originals into a folder I brought from my car, and stood there long enough to feel the heat in my face ebb into a colder resolve, because this was no longer about whether my family liked Jordan or thought my boundaries were dramatic. This was evidence that could walk and talk in any room I chose to enter. And as I locked the cabinet and drove away with the folder on the passenger seat like a quiet passenger that would not let me forget what it contained, I knew exactly what the next day would require, which was not another argument at a kitchen table, but a formal call to the venue, a precise email to the lender, and a meeting set on my terms with anyone who believed that my signature was a family resource to be borrowed at will, because the proof in that drawer had turned speculation into fact. And once you have facts, you do not ask permission to act, you act and let everyone else decide whether they want to join reality. At work the following week, I moved through my tasks with a deliberate precision that almost looked like detachment to anyone watching, because the only way to preserve a career when your personal life threatens to spill over is to act as though you are insulated, untouchable, and unaffected, even when the truth is that you are checking your personal email every hour to confirm that the attachments you sent to yourself are still there, unaltered and intact, and even when your mind is constantly running simulations of what might happen if your employer receives a call from a relative who decides to mix family revenge with professional sabotage, which, given Carol's history of crossing lines whenever she feels cornered, was not a distant possibility but a probability I had to factor into every step I took. I had emailed the venue the previous evening with a clear and unemotional message, attaching the forged authorization forms and a copy of my actual signature for comparison, requesting the immediate removal of my name from their records and a confirmation that I bore no financial responsibility for the account in question. And by noon the next day, I received a hurried call from a manager whose tone carried that unmistakable blend of panic and urgency that comes from realizing their business might be implicated in a fraud scandal during peak wedding season, which is a reputational risk they cannot afford, and within minutes, we had arranged a meeting to review the account in person. I asked Jordan to come with me, not because I needed someone to argue on my behalf, but because I needed a witness who understood the difference between righteous anger and strategic composure. And Jordan has always had the gift of pulling me back from the edge of shouting when shouting would feel good but accomplish nothing. We walked into the venue's office the next day, a room that had been decorated with glossy brochures and framed photographs of happy couples who had no idea how thin the line was between celebration and catastrophe, and across the table sat the manager, a woman who looked both apologetic and terrified that this meeting might end with a legal notice rather than a negotiated solution. Before she could launch into her rehearsed apology, the door opened and Emily walked in with Brett at her side, her expression not contrite or nervous, but defensive, as though she were the victim being dragged into some cruel inquisition instead of the person who had signed her name to a dream funded by someone else's credit. She began with a speech about sisterhood, loyalty, and the importance of not making things harder than they already were, words that sounded less like an appeal and more like a manipulation meant to put me back in the role I had finally refused to play. And I listened quietly, not interrupting, because sometimes silence exposes more than arguments ever could. When she finished, I told her simply that optics do not pay interest, and that while she could design whatever narrative she liked for her friends about the sacrifices she made to build her perfect day, the reality was that a lender did not accept sisterhood as collateral. The manager, perhaps relieved that I had not raised my voice, offered what she called a courtesy transfer, essentially a chance to replace me with a qualified signer within a week, which sounded merciful on the surface, but was, in truth, an ultimatum designed to shield the business from liability while giving Emily and Brett one last chance to scramble. Brett immediately tried to insert himself, claiming that his uncle could sign and that his credit was solid, but when the manager asked for documentation and an increased deposit to secure the switch, Brett's confidence flickered. And Emily's face betrayed the truth she would never admit aloud, that they were running out of people willing to be harnessed into their plan. I stepped outside for air, my head pounding not from the confrontation itself, but from the weight of knowing that no matter how cleanly I drew my boundaries, there would always be another angle, another manipulation, another plea wrapped in accusation. And while I stood in the parking lot staring at the rows of cars that belonged to other couples who had likely never thought of forged signatures as part of their wedding narrative, my phone buzzed with a number I had saved years ago but never called. It was Aunt Deborah. She said Frank had told her enough, that she had kept her distance from family politics because Carol had a way of turning every conversation into a trial where the verdict was predetermined. But that this time she was not interested in watching silently while my name became the family's most convenient commodity. She told me she had funds set aside and a lawyer who enjoyed writing contracts that held up in rooms where excuses collapsed, and she offered me a deal that was so clean and so unexpected it almost felt like a lifeline, though not the kind you grip in desperation, but the kind that confirms you are right not to sink. Her offer was this. She would cover a portion of the wedding costs, not as charity but as leverage, if Emily signed a straightforward agreement forbidding the use of my name, credit, or data for any purpose without my written consent. And if Carol provided a written apology acknowledging her attempt to use my identity without authorization, if they refused, Deborah would instead fund my attorney to pursue every available remedy, including criminal charges if it came to that. The clarity of it was almost disorienting, because I had grown used to the fog of half-truths and guilt trips that passed for communication in this family, and here was someone saying plainly that choices had consequences and that love, if it existed at all, was not measured by how much damage I could absorb in silence. I returned to the meeting and delivered the terms as calmly as if I were reading an agenda, and Emily's response was to accuse me of turning Deborah against the family, which was laughable given that Carol had done that years ago when she exiled her own sister with a set of insults sharp enough to leave scars. Brett tried to joke about lawyer drama, but his voice carried that tightness people get when they know the room has shifted against them, and, for once, I did not feel the need to fill the silence with explanations. The manager, clearly eager to move the process along, reminded everyone that a final decision would be required by Friday if they wanted to keep their date, and I let the weight of that deadline hang in the air without cushioning it for anyone. And as I drove away later with Jordan beside me, my phone vibrating with texts from relatives already buzzing with rumors about what had happened in the venue's office, I knew that I had finally reached the point where silence was no longer the price of belonging, but the currency of erasure, because to stay quiet now would mean agreeing that my identity could be borrowed, bent, and reshaped until it was unrecognizable. What came next would not be another tense dinner conversation or another plea disguised as tradition. What came next would be a decision, made on paper and in front of witnesses, about whether Emily and Carol were willing to put their names, and not mine, on the future they insisted belonged only to them. The bridal shower was supposed to be the moment when everyone set aside grudges, slipped into polite small talk, and pretended that the family had never fractured under the weight of comparisons, accusations, and whispered alliances. Yet when I walked into the decorated banquet room with its pastel centerpieces and carefully curated playlist of love songs, I knew with absolute certainty that this was not going to be a celebration in the traditional sense, but rather the final arena where the Lines I had drawn would either hold or collapse, because silence had already proven itself to be too expensive, and the price of pretending had reached a level that even I could not afford. I sat through the gift opening, the polite laughter at inside jokes that never included me, the whispered commentary about the honeymoon that Emily and Brett had not yet paid for but were already advertising like a business venture, and I waited. Not because I enjoy the buildup of tension, but because timing is as important in family confrontations as it is in negotiations with strangers, and if you move too soon you are dismissed as dramatic, while if you move too late you are painted as vindictive, so I chose the middle. That moment when the chatter had dulled and people's attention drifted, but had not yet dispersed. I stood and thanked the hosts for their efforts, and then I pulled a single sheet of paper from my bag. Not the thick folder of evidence I had collected, but a distilled agreement crafted with the help of a lawyer who understood that plain English can be more powerful than legal jargon, because clarity removes the wiggle room where manipulation lives. I explained, in one long breath that left no space for interruption, that this agreement was my gift to Emily, one that offered her the chance to move forward without the weight of unresolved disputes, and that all it required was a signature. The terms were simple. She and anyone acting with her knowledge would never again use my name, my credit, or my identifying information for any purpose without my explicit written authorization. And any violation would trigger a fixed penalty payable not just to me but to a nonprofit of Jordan's choosing, because consequences sting more when they carry both personal and public cost. Carol, in turn, would provide a written acknowledgement of the forgery attempt and a pledge to refrain from using my private life as table entertainment. I told them the choice was theirs: sign and move forward, or refuse and face the consequences, which included me filing formal reports with both the lender and law enforcement. The air in the room shifted instantly, like a pressure drop before a storm, and I could feel every set of eyes gauging whether I had finally lost my composure or whether this was the moment I had been quietly preparing for. And Carol leaned back in her chair with that look of maternal disappointment she has perfected over decades, saying softly but clearly that I was humiliating my sister on a day meant for joy, as if the true humiliation had not already occurred when my identity was misused to prop up a fantasy. Emily's face flushed, and she accused me of trying to ruin her happiness, insisting that by forcing legal language into what she framed as family business, I was dragging private matters into a spotlight they did not deserve. And Brett attempted to smooth the situation with a clumsy joke about lawyers making everything complicated, but his voice cracked, betraying that even he recognized the seriousness of the paper I held. And then something happened that even I had not expected, though in hindsight it felt inevitable. Jordan, who had sat quietly at my side throughout the event, stood and spoke, not in anger, but in that measured tone that cuts through noise without raising volume, and said that we were prepared to protect our future together, that my credit, my name, and my time were not bargaining chips to be tossed around in the name of family tradition, and that anyone who believed otherwise was welcome to test the strength of our resolve in whatever forum they chose. The simplicity of the statement was more powerful than any outburst could have been, because it reframed everything. It was no longer Lauren versus the family, it was we versus a pattern, and the witnesses in the room heard it clearly. Frank, who had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility, cleared his throat and said, with surprising steadiness, that Grandma Ruth had chosen me as the safeguard for a reason, that he was finished watching me be used as the family's insurance policy, and that while he could not undo the choices already made, he could finally say out loud that what had been done was wrong. He reached for the pen first, not because he needed to sign but because he wanted to show me, and perhaps everyone else, that his allegiance was no longer hidden. Aunt Deborah, never one to miss a chance to puncture pretense, raised her glass and said she would support either choice Emily made: sign and keep the date, or refuse and deal with the consequences, but she would not fund or endorse a wedding built on theft. And then she texted her lawyer in plain sight, a deliberate move that reminded everyone that promises backed by resources carry more weight than speeches filled with sentiment. Emily's hands trembled as she took the paper from me, tears welling up not from remorse, but from the pressure of realizing that the world she had crafted, where my role was to be the unacknowledged guarantor of her milestones, was collapsing under the weight of a single page of truth. She asked if I really wanted her to choose between me and Mom, and I told her that Carol had made that choice for her when she forged my name, because actions define loyalty more than words. Carol scoffed, insisting that the term forgery was harsh, and I replied that I was simply borrowing the vocabulary used by the county clerk, which was not subject to revision. With every second of silence that followed, the balance of power shifted further, until Emily, with a sob that sounded more like defeat than sorrow, signed the paper, and Brett, perhaps realizing that the optics of refusal would brand him permanently as a parasite, added his name as well. Carol refused to sign, claiming she would not submit to a public shaming, but the agreement did not require her, only Emily, and as I slipped the signed document back into my folder, Jordan squeezed my hand under the table. A small gesture that carried more intimacy than any staged announcement ever could. I left the shower not with triumph, but with a clarity I had never carried before, because I understood that victory in families like mine is not about everyone cheering your name, but about no longer allowing your name to be used without your consent. In the parking lot, Carol followed me to my car and told me someday I would thank her for keeping the family together, and I told her that we simply disagreed on what together meant, because for me, together cannot mean theft, silence, and the endless expectation that one daughter will always foot the bill for everyone else's illusions. She said I had turned everyone against her, and I told her she had managed that on her own, because love without boundaries is not love, it is extraction, and I closed my door without waiting for her response. That night, I drove to Jordan's condo, where a lease with my name already prepared sat in a drawer, waiting for my decision, and for the first time I did not hesitate. In the weeks that followed, I did not post celebratory photos or issue dramatic statements, because I had learned that justice, when real, does not need a performance. Instead, I helped Frank complete the paperwork to exercise the options he had nearly lost, and when he called to tell me the credit card was finally paid off, his laugh carried the sound of relief that cannot be faked. A month later, Emily sent invitations with my name printed beside Jordan's, and while Carol's role in the planning had been temporarily paused, no one dared to phrase it as punishment. Yet everyone knew that for the first time in years the family orbit no longer revolved around her control, but around the simple rule I had written on a single page. Whether that change lasts is not mine to predict, but for once, the future does not feel like a script written by someone else. It feels like a life I am finally allowed to author on my own terms.